Every time I hear about your assertion that certain principles of language are innate, I can't get over my response that that seems an explanation of sorts of last resort, and I keep wanting to say instead that we have not yet figured out how we can extract those principles from experience. And
that's a common reaction, and I think it's an interesting fact that people have that reaction. So it's very, in fact, what you're saying is very characteristic, and it's an interesting fact about the intellectual culture, which goes back hundreds of years. And notice that you have, I assume you would have a very different reaction to say, let me ask you the following question. Suppose that, as far as I'm aware, nobody knows anything about the biological factors involved in puberty. Okay. Now suppose that somebody comes along and says, and also as far as I'm aware, every developmental biologist assumes that puberty is basically programmed. I mean, it'll happen, or when it'll happen can be affected by nutritional level or something and so on. Suppose somebody came along and said, well, that's an explanation of last resort. It really results from peer pressure, but we just haven't figured it out yet. I mean, it really results from the fact that, these young people, 10 years old, see their friends going through puberty and they want to be like everyone else, and that's why they're doing it. Okay, well, that's conceivable. Now, the point is, when you make that proposal, everybody laughs. Now, the question is, what's the difference? Why do we think it's ridiculous in one case and plausible in the other case? As far as I know, the evidence is about the same. In fact, the evidence for innate structure is probably better for things above the neck, because there we're not in total ignorance. We actually have some strong proposals about the innate principles and some explanatory force to them, too. So by the standards of the sciences, at least, we have more reason to believe in the innate principles above the neck than below the neck. And in fact, they also did in the 17th century. The one case that I mentioned, if you go through it more, it's more convincing, about Descartes and Hume, is an example of that. There were some phenomena around. Everyone agreed on the phenomena. There was very strong evidence by the criteria of the sciences to take Descartes' solution, that it's innate. That's why it happens. Nevertheless, the long-term consequences were acceptance of Hume's solution with its self-refutation that we don't have the concept of a straight line. Now, I think that reflects that same strange intuition that people have. Above the neck, we insist that everything's got to be experienced. Below the neck, we're quite willing to accept the idea that everything is the way any rational person would think. If you have things that happen without information, it must be coming from inside. And I think the question is, why the dualism? Well, if there were any rational support for it, you could look at that argument, but there isn't any. What it comes down to is exactly the feeling that you express, and that's the standard opinion. So we have to ask a question about irrational attitudes. Why this particular irrational attitude? And that's what it is. And you could have various speculations about it. My frank opinion is that it's a reflection of a kind of something which also showed up in traditional dualism. So, I mean, as humans, it's very natural to think of people as having a mind and a body which are separate. And the problem about how to connect them. Traditional mind-body dualism was very commonsensical. I think that probably is the way we think about people. That's why we would regard someone as being the same person if their body underwent all, what we call their body underwent all sorts of changes, but we would think of them as a different person if you recoded their brains and they had somebody else's memories and language and thoughts and so on. Okay, that's just the way we look at people, and it's very hard to get out of it. Just like it's very hard to look at the sun setting and to tell yourself it's not setting, the earth's turning. I mean, you sort of know that at some level, but there's no way for you to look at that and stop seeing it as the sun setting. You just can't. And I think when we look at people, it's extremely hard for us to look at them and not see them as minds inside bodies. Well, traditional dualism, metaphysical dualism, collapsed for scientific reasons. But that doesn't mean we can get out of our skins. We still look at people this way. And I think what has replaced traditional dualism is a kind of an epistemological dualism, which comes out pretty much like this. It says, below the neck, I mean that metaphorically, like, on the things that people call physical, we're willing to pursue the methods of the sciences. And if they lead us to conclude that things are internally programmed, we'll accept it. Above the neck, we're going to be completely irrational. We're going to insist on what we would never dream of in the case of things that fall on our side of the intuitive boundary physical. And I think that's probably correct. I don't see any other way of explaining this strange phenomenon for the last several hundred years, that the very same kind of evidence, in fact even better evidence than that which would make us laugh about puberty and peer pressure, has made people think we can't do that in the case of mental activity. If there's another explanation, I don't know it, but I think we're in the domain of trying to account for irrational human beliefs.